Bueno, bienvenidos a todos al tercer día de Lawyers Polo, el primero en el Teatro Colón, de bienvenida, para ir conociéndonos y conociendo Buenos Aires. El segundo día en la alegría, con varios partidos, mucho calor. Pero bueno, por suerte todos los partidos salieron muy bien. A mí me tocó perder. Vamos a revertir eso mañana. Bueno, les quiero presentar a los dos speakers de esta noche, porque el Lawyers Polo no es solamente polo y no es solamente diversión. Es una charla que no tiene por qué ser aburrida, por lo contrario son temas muy interesantes, pero bueno, es un momento para ponernos un poquito más serios. Vamos a hablar de los conflictos actuales: Ucrania, Rusia, China, Estados Unidos. Tal vez China y Estados Unidos no un conflicto frontal directo todavía. Y de las implicancias que esos conflictos o tensiones tienen en la economía del mundo. Los speakers de esta noche son Dan Scott, a mi derecha, del banco Vontobel de Suiza. Dan ha sido CEO del banco, CIO del banco. Es un economista, experto en inversión. Comenzó su carrera en Wall Street Journal y luego en CNBC. Y ahora, desde hace... ¿cuántos años? For the last 5 years he has been in Vontobel, the Swiss bank. He's a very nice person, but he's also very strong in what he does. Maneja actualmente activos por valor de $30.000 millones. Así que sabe hacer algunos cálculos. A mi izquierda, David Tafuri, muchos de ustedes ya conocen, de Betererbide. David se unió a Lawyers Polo este año y en un año hizo 2 Lawyers Polo, un récord. David es abogado en Washington, D.C., en el estudio Arent Fox. Es experto en democracias emergentes. Fue asesor de la Casa Blanca como parte del Departamento de Estado y luego asesor directo de Barack Obama durante las elecciones presidenciales. Es columnista diario semanal de CNN y de Fox News. Experto en política internacional, experto en Ucrania, en el conflicto Ucrania-Rusia, y si no me equivoco estuvo reunido con Volodymyr Zelensky, el presidente de Ucrania, 2 veces este año. ¿Correcto? Con esa introducción vamos a pasar a algunas preguntas sobre estos temas y por supuesto luego daremos el micrófono a ustedes para que puedan hacer libremente, en total libertad, las preguntas que quieran, aún las que consideren políticamente incorrectas, que son las mejores. David, we know that there is a conflict between Russia and Ukraine that started in February of this year. We know that Russia started very strongly, then they had to set back. But we would like to know exactly where the border is today and where the conflict sits today.
Thank you, Eduardo. Thank you to everybody for coming tonight. I really appreciate it. It's really fun to get a chance to talk to you guys about the things that I do, and I really enjoy my private discussions with each of you about what you do. I want to answer that question. It's a tough question. Let's go over just a few facts. It's almost 10 months since the invasion by Russia. Russia has lost anywhere from 60,000 to 100,000 troops since the invasion. The 60,000 estimate is from the US. Ukraine estimates it's 100,000. It's probably somewhere in between. Ukraine has lost slightly less troops, probably somewhere between 30,000 and 50,000. And both sides have substantial casualties. It's not going to end anytime soon. I've used this map here that Eduardo brought, which has Ukraine right here, and Ukraine has momentum now on the battlefield. They've recovered about 50% of the territory that Russia took in the first few weeks of the invasion on February 24th. Where the Russian forces still occupy is sort of a crescent area that goes like this, from the eastern area, which is known as Donbass, which has the provinces of Donetsk and Lugansk, but they lost Kharkiv, which is Ukraine's second biggest city. They tried to take it, were unable, and they've been pushed back to here, and they have down to here. This is Crimea, which they had before the war, before the invasion, starting in 2014 when they annexed it, and they come down to here. Now this crescent is important to Russia. They wanted more, they had more at the beginning of the invasion, but they still have basically a land bridge to get to Crimea. And it was very difficult for them to supply Crimea before that because there was not a bridge here, although they recently built one and the Ukrainians attacked it recently, which you might have heard about in the news. So that's kind of what they control right now. They most significantly lost the town of Kherson, which is right here, right on the other side of this river. That's notable because just about 8 weeks ago, Russia held a referendum and annexed 4 provinces in Ukraine. And one of the provinces they annexed was Kherson, and now they don't even control the capital city of Kherson, which demonstrates to you, the weaknesses in their argument that that was a legitimate referendum. They didn't even control all the territory when they had it, and now they control even less. But what I said is that I don't think it's going to end anytime soon because I think Putin is still in control of his own forces, in control of his own country, despite the substantial losses. He doesn't appear to be willing to back down at this point, and he made comments just today that this is going to be a long war. I'll leave it there and we'll talk more.
Thank you, David. And in terms of movements of troops, are any side moving towards the west, Russia, or Ukraine toward the east, or it's a period of, we can say, like stagnation where there are no movements?
It's currently a stalemate. Part of the reason it's stalemated is because when Ukraine took the town of Kherson, which is right on the other, I know it's hard for you guys to see, but right on this other side of this river, they haven't been able to, they've been careful about not crossing this river yet. The Russian troops are literally just right on the other side of the river, a mile from where Ukrainian troops are, and they know they're going to suffer significant losses when they go across that river. There's a big battle for a town called Bakhmut, which is somewhere around here in the eastern part. It doesn't really have any strategic value. It's just a town that had 70,000 people in it, 70,000 Ukrainians. But the reason it's important is because it's shown some weakness in terms of its defenses by Ukraine, and Russia desperately wants to take a new area because that would embolden them. And so they've been trying for the last couple months to take Bakhmut, and it's the bloodiest part of the battle right now. You can expect that the Ukrainians are planning another offensive, but they've been very, very tricky about what they do. For instance, when they took the south, everyone expected them to kind of take attack the east. They were even putting forces up in the east to make it look like they were to do a major offensive in the east, and then they came and took the south. And they might do that again. There's some speculation they may try to go and take Crimea, even though that would be unusual and not expected because Crimea is really reinforced because Russia has held it since 2014. And unlike some of the new territories that Ukraine has taken, there's not as much opposition among the local population in Crimea anymore. But they've shown an ability to be very resourceful in their military strategy, so we don't know what they'll do next.
Thank you, David. In terms of strategy, what's the strategy of each side today? How they think they are gonna move on the next, let's say, 6 months, and what they actually want to do. Ukraine, for example, they want to continue going east, I guess. Can they do it? Do they have enough equipment and resources? What's on the other side? What's the plan of Russia? Are they just waiting for another long winter, like they have done in many wars before? Is the winter good for Russia, or is it good for Ukraine?
The winter is good for a force that's trying to move and trying to attack, right? Because it's easier to move your tanks and your personnel carriers when the ground freezes. So that has some advantages for both sides. And some people expect that Russia might, generate a new offensive as the ground freezes. We don't know. I mean, clearly part of Putin's strategy right now, which has been in the news, is to try to test the Ukrainian people's will. That's why he's done more than 1,000 airstrikes on Ukraine's infrastructure, their electricity, their power grid. He's hitting their fuel supplies. So most Ukrainians do not have power for significant periods of the day, or sometimes they go weeks without power. So that's part of his strategy. It's akin to terrorism, targeting civilians like that, and targeting civilian infrastructure. And I think he thinks he may get some value out of that. My personal view, talking to Ukrainians, having been there, I don't think it's going to work. I don't think I think it's only going to cause Ukrainians to be even more resolute. I mean, it's painful to not have heat in your home, but they can get through that knowing they have brothers and sons on the front lines fighting. I think they're going to be able to get through that. I don't think it's going to work. It'll be a tough winter, but they'll get to the other side of spring and be just as resolute in continuing to fight against Russia. That's basically what we know about the two sides' intent.
Thank you. It looks like it's very tough on both sides, which may result in a long war or a long conflict, maybe of less intensity. But what do you think, according to your views and what you've seen on the ground, and if you can tell, but I know that your conversations with Zelensky might have been confidential, but as long as you can tell us, an eventual end to the conflict, if any, how would that be in terms of timing and in terms of format? It would be an agreement, it would be one side destroying the other.
So when I talked to some of you in this group in March when we were in South Africa and Plettenberg, right after that I went to Poland and to the border with Ukraine, and then I went to Ukraine a couple of times. I went back to the States and I went back 2 more times. And those 2 times I took people to go and see President Zelensky, and I spent about 2.5 hours in total with him in 2 separate meetings. My view of him is he's very strategic, he's very, very confident, but he's also a good listener. He spent most of the time listening to us, the people we were with, rather than talking, which is unusual for other leaders that I've met. But one thing he kept, the 2 things, he said a lot of things, but a couple of things that stood out to me. One was that he did not plan to give up an inch of territory. I mean, he's very, very insistent that they are not going to cede any areas of Ukraine that Russia has taken, including the areas that they took in 2014. And after one time I was there, they had a conference about Crimea, and it seemed bizarre to me that they spent a week, or a couple of days in a conference about Crimea when there's much more urgent situations and territory that had just been taken. But that's kind of the mindset, and that's the mindset of most Ukrainians. They can't imagine, signing any kind of agreement where they give up any territory at all. The other thing that he talked about, particularly in the second meeting I had with him, and I understand it's still his major concern, is he's very worried about fatigue around the world. his main thing was like, how do I keep people in America, people in Europe, people in other countries that are supporting us at top of mind, that keep Ukraine at the top of their minds, and keep them interested in continuing to support us. That was really his biggest worry. And you see, he's very kind of media savvy, and the reason is because he's trying to get people's attention. He has people in, he's got an audience, a domestic audience that he needs to keep on his side, but that's pretty easy right now. I mean, probably 95% of Ukrainians support it. That's a lot of that media that he's doing, and he gives speeches, and he zooms in to Davos and to parliaments around the world, and talk to our Congress in the US. That's to try and keep reminding people that this is not just his war, it's not just Ukrainians' war, it's a war for the world against a totalitarian state, and that if we don't win in Ukraine, that Russia will go after another country, and that it will embolden other countries to do the same. And so that was a lot of what we talked about. And then we talked a lot about just what else could be done to kind of support Ukraine. And he really gets into the weeds, and we talked a lot about, and we'll talk about this later, I think, like, how do we deal with the grain? How do we make sure we can export our grain? How do we deal with, he knew even in the summer when I was with him that they were going to face problems with energy and keeping the lights on.
Yeah, that's a good point, that it might have an impact on the local economy, on commodities and agricultural products. Do you know more or less how the transportation lines work today, or if they work? Like trains, we have read and heard that some train lines have been bombed, and others can be used, but of course it's risky to use them. On that line also there was I don't know if it was an agreement between the West and Russia to free the shipping from some ports. I don't know if that agreement is still in force. What do you know about that?
Yeah, so I know some about that. First of all, each of the 4 times that I went into Ukraine since the invasion, I took trains for part or all of the trip. The last 2, it was completely on trains. I would get on a private train from Poland, took me all the way into Kiev, and then we were able to take trains all around Ukraine from there. So trains are operating. And I spent a lot of time with the CEO of the Ukrainian railway. These guys are great. These guys are like, the CEO and the deputy CEO are like in their late 30s, and they're super entrepreneurial, and they, as soon as a track gets hit, they're already fixing it. When we would go by, they'd stop and they'd be like, see that track got hit? It got hit, yesterday, and there'd be 40 people out there in a crane, and they're already repairing it, or they're finding another way to go. So the trains are the main way that people can travel, and they can get in supplies in a reliable manner. And Russia has hit a couple train stations and has hit some tracks, but they really haven't had any success in preventing the trains from bringing in goods and transporting people. Ukraine is obviously one of the biggest exporters of grain, of wheat and corn and soybeans, and most of that came out of these ports in here, and these ports have all been blocked in the Black Sea. They were all blocked and blockaded by Russia. So for months, as you read about, Ukraine was not able to export grain at all. And it was a huge problem. It's such a big part of their economy, but it's also a big problem for parts of the world that were relying on that grain, especially in Africa. They worked out a deal with Russia, which President Zelensky was very negative about the prospects of that working. But they actually did enter into a deal where Russia allowed grain export to leave Ukraine, and so it kind of ceded the blockade. And that was a deal brokered by Turkey and the UN. And it's odd that Turkey is playing that role, and you might wonder why. How is Turkey a mediator of the war between Ukraine and Russia is because Turkey is kind of on both sides. Turkey is providing drones, very effective drones to Ukraine, but Turkey is also sort of allied with Russia, still dealing with Russia. A lot of Russian money is going to Turkey. A lot of oligarchs who've been sanctioned around the world are now in Turkey. So that's why Turkey played that role. That deal then was broken by Russia, and for a period they were not letting ships leave with grain, and then they started again about a month ago. My understanding is that exports are able to leave, but Ukraine realizes that Russia can shut down that deal anytime and put back in place a blockade. So one of the things we talked about with President Zelensky about, because one of the people I had with me, it was Howard Buffett, who's the son of Warren Buffett, one of the biggest investors in the United States, and they own a railroad in the US. And so one of the problems that Ukraine faced, and this is kind of interesting, I think, is the railway in Ukraine is the width of the rails are the same width that all former Soviet states had. And when a Ukrainian train tries to cross into Poland, the rails are a different width. There was a reason for that, because Poland wanted to make it hard for the Soviet Union to invade them, or Russia to invade them. As a result, Ukraine was not able to use the trains to export grain, but they understood they needed to figure out a solution to that. It was too hard to just redo all the tracks all over Ukraine. So one of the things that they were working on when I was there was trying to set up these headquarters where a train could come in, go up a hill, and then it would be above another train, and then all the cars would empty grain at the same time into cars below it. So that was one solution. It's kind of an example of how they were being resourceful. We had the same problem in Romania. They couldn't take trains into Romania. There was even a bigger problem with Poland, because at one point, the best port to export from, because they couldn't export from ports in Ukraine, was in Lithuania, and they literally have to change trains in Poland, wrong size, go back into Lithuania, and that's the same as Ukraine. So they have a lot of challenges with exporting grain if the blockade goes back in place, and I expect if they do, we'll face the same problems with food shortages. Right now, the only thing they can do is truck out grain and wheat, corn, soybeans, but that's not very efficient.
Thank you, David. And on the deal, that apparent deal to free the ports and that Russia would not bomb the ships leaving from Ukrainian ports, is that still on, or was ever?
So that is currently on. As of, it went back on. It was Russia broke the deal for a while and was not letting ships leave, and then about a month ago they agreed to it again. The reason Russia is claiming that they stopped allowing it for a period is they were claiming that Ukraine was using the ability to navigate that waterway to then attack Russian ships, which Ukraine denies. But it is back on right now, but it is very vulnerable at any point when Russia or Putin become unhappy to being stopped again.
Understood.
Tell us about the sanctions the other countries have put on Russia. Those sanctions have been effective or not? These two wars, the war of soldiers and the war of national class. So what is happening? Those sanctions are actually being effective. So what is going to happen in Russia?
First of all, I completely agree with you. There are two wars, and Ukraine really needs its supporters to win both wars for it to ultimately prevail against Russia. So the sanctions war, Ukraine desperately needs for countries to maintain fidelity to the sanctions. On one side, you might say the sanctions are not working because Russia has been able to sell oil, and because oil prices went up so much, some calculations suggest they were still bringing in just as much revenue. And so they weren't financially suffering. But a new rule went into place on Monday, actually, which put, and you might have read about it, which put a cap on the price that Russia can sell its oil to G7 countries, and G7 countries are pressuring other countries to agree to this cap. That puts the price of oil at $60 a barrel. The goal with that, and it's very controversial because some people think it won't work, but the goal with that was to find a price so that Russia would still be motivated to sell oil. Because if the price is too low, they're going to say, okay, we're not going to sell any oil anymore, and stop exporting oil. But to find a price that was induce them to still sell oil, but ensure they weren't making a significant profit. And that's, the price of oil I think is around $80 right now, $79, $80, something like that. And so that's how they landed at $60. And there are people on both sides of it. This has never really been done before. And this is a weird sanction because it's not saying you can't sell, it's saying you can't sell for a price above $60. And with any sanction, you know, part of whether it works is whether it can be enforced. And there are questions about whether you can really enforce a deal when Russia's selling oil and you can ensure that it's only selling it for $60. It could, of course, do deals with other countries where it sells it for $60 and then somehow the country transfers money another way to make up for the difference. So this is a big question right now, and we don't know if it's going to work or not. Other sanctions are definitely working, and you know, there are a lot of reports that suggest that Russia cannot rebuild some of the weapons that they need because they cannot get the component parts from around the world. And that may be a small problem now, but that's a problem that snowball as their weapons get depleted and they need to resupply, they need to fix weapons, fix tanks. And so I think that's going to be part of what makes it very difficult. I think sanctions on oligarchs supported Russia. You know, many of the oligarchs have been able to, you know, get around those sanctions. They lost, you know, their super yachts and things like that, but they're still quite wealthy. But it's going to be harder and harder for them to do business, to travel, and so the goal of those sanctions is to get the people close to Putin, who support Putin, to put pressure on Putin to end the war.
Now, on that note that we are speaking about prices, I think it's on numbers. It's a good time to turn to Dan. The first question is a simple question: What's the major impact of this conflict in today's economy?
Yeah, I think it's a great bridge, the question, because obviously my mandate is to invest money, and so I'm going to stick away or try and stay away from the politics and look at the numbers for investors. And the immediate impact, of course, for us in February when this happened was the inflationary impact. All wars are inflationary. This one is particularly inflationary because, as David was pointing out before, Russia and Ukraine together make up something like 30% of the world's wheat. And then there's also the oil story. Now, the oil story, remember, this is self-inflicted. We're actually sanctioning Russia's oil. It's not that they wouldn't want to sell it. But that also is very inflationary for us. So if you look at the numbers, Russia in 21 produced around 12 million barrels of oil per day. Global oil production daily was running around 95 million barrels per day. So roughly 10% of the world's oil from Russia. So it's not non-significant. It's something you need to consider if all of a sudden 10% of your global supply is with a question mark. And I say question mark because none of us in February knew what the direct impact would be. You know, Russia has pipelines. If there was a pipeline map, you'd see two pipelines that go east, the East Siberian. One goes directly into China, and one goes into China via Kazakhstan. Now those are still fully operational. Russia is still pumping oil to China and asking the Chinese to take as much as possible because clearly they've lost some clients in the West. However, there are also pipelines into Europe. Obviously, you know about the Druzhba pipeline, which is the one that was still operational for a while until it got shut off, and then we had. And then we also have a pipeline that goes through the Ukraine, which it's still operational, and Europe is still taking oil And this brings me to this point about the price caps. It's a little bit of political game. This is as far as I'm going to venture into the topic of politics tonight. It's a little bit of a game of politics as far as I can tell, because setting this price cap at that level is fairly irrelevant, because Urals crude is very low quality oil. Urals crude is very high in sulfur. There are not many refineries that can handle this oil, and it's always traded at a pretty big discount to WTI or Brent. So putting a cap 20% below global oil market prices basically puts the cap at a price where they would be selling it anyway. So I think what you see is that Europe is in a situation where they want to be tough on Russia, but they just can't, because they need the energy. And because of the energy transition, they're in a situation where, you know, they just need to quickly find a solution, and quickly is not so easy. So we're busy trying to have regasification ships, so that we can take liquid gas from Qatar or Algeria or whatever, from the US, and ship this into Europe. But being Europe, of course, everyone protests. As soon as, so I have a European perspective because I'm based in Europe, and as soon as you want to do anything in Europe, there's a protest. So, you know, we know of this from the, you know, structural reform in France. You know, everyone puts on yellow vests, and no, we can't move the retirement age. You know, you want to put a liquefaction, regasification boat outside the coast of Italy, then everyone's going to protest because, you know, their house values are going to go down because it's not so pretty to have this ugly ship there in the ocean. It's very difficult to make this quick transition. And so that's what we're struggling with at the moment in Europe. The one idea that no one really wants to talk about is that we could solve this issue overnight by flipping the nuclear power switch back on again. But ESG investors and the Germans, mainly behind this decision, are holding steadfast and saying, no, we've decided against nuclear, we're shutting it off, and we're not going to turn it back on again. But if they really were interested in weaning themselves off of Russian energy overnight, they could just turn on their nuclear again. The French have a completely different view. They think nuclear is very sustainable, it's a very clean energy, so this war is, because it is a war, right? The Russians pretend it's an invasion. It's very clearly an illegal invasion. It's a war. But it's really tearing away at the social fabric in Europe too, because you have some real deep discussions being held within Europe on how to position here and how real, you know, how heavy we are with our measures against Russia. So that's the inflation part on the geopolitics. And if you allow me, I'm going to pull the conversation a little bit away from Russia-Ukraine, or as Russia likes to paint it, if this is Russia versus the West, and the Ukraine is just a proxy. And back to markets, this year has all been about fear and insecurity. And when this invasion happened in February, it was yet another, you know, bash in the face for an investor like me in terms of fear and insecurity. Because I already had pretty bad inflation before this happened. And now you've got a supply shock that just adds extra energy inflation on top of the ESG inflation, the so-called greenflation that we have, on top of the both demand pull and cost push that David was mentioning, inflation that we had because of you know, COVID and loose money supply. So inflation brought fear and insecurity because we don't know what the end game is on inflation. And if we end up in the West with the same experience as you have here in Argentina, then we have a real issue with asset prices in Western countries because they're going to take a big dip lower. The other fear and insecurity is central banks. You know, we went from 25, if we had this conversation 6 months ago, any economic strategist would have told you, interest rates up, are you kidding me? Come on. You know, maybe in 2023 we'll have the first rate hike. Yeah, and now we've gone from 25 basis points to 4%. It's the steepest hiking cycle that we've had in decades. That's a monumental draw in liquidity that we haven't seen since the financial crisis. So that's a big deal for people like me because, you know, every ratcheting up of this rate means the cost of capital is repriced. And if I don't know where this journey ends, it means I have insecurity. I don't know how to do a DCF if I don't know where the terminal rate is. And if every day it's like, oh, maybe it's 3, maybe it's 4, maybe it's 5, maybe it's 7, that just creates insecurity. So bad for risk assets. And then last but not least is, you know, how everyone talks about the going into a recession. I think this is the one I worry about least, but it's also an insecurity. You know, everyone's very concerned about a recession, and it's possible to talk yourself into a recession, by the way. If we all convince ourselves in the room that we're going into a recession, we adjust our spending patterns, we adjust our investments, and we end up creating a recession just through our behavior. So the way things look to me right now is that we're probably not going into a deep, dark recession. But anyway, there is fear and insecurity and on those 3 topics. Rates, inflation, where we are in the cycle, and then having a situation on geopolitics, not just Russia, Ukraine, but also China, Taiwan, is a big deal. Because apart from this war, the next big political event that I had, and I usually don't have a geopolitical event in a year, and I definitely never have 2 in 1 year, was the Chinese National Party Congress. Because, you know, everyone was saying, oh, you know what they're going to do? They're going to say we beat COVID, that we're going to reopen the economy, and everything's going to be great again. China's going to stimulate, the economy's going to boom. And exactly the opposite happens. No, they reinforced zero COVID. They mentioned security 60 times during the party congress. They never mentioned economic reform. And it's very clear that Xi Jinping is not interested in what Hu Jintao was interested in, i.e. bringing China into the folds of globalization and trade and liberal free markets. No, this is all about, you know, bringing a legacy, making sure that China takes its rightful place as a powerful nation that has influence geopolitically across the world. And so as an asset allocator, that was the next big event that we had to deal with, which we can go into details later in terms of individual asset prices. But yeah, my main message for the intro is that, you know, fear and insecurity is really what markets have had to deal with this year.
Thank you, Dan. That was very interesting. On that note, on China-US, we are going to ask a few questions to David. One quick question, as I'm not an economist. Are you saying that if there was a peace between Ukraine and Russia, the inflationary movement that we see today might continue?
So I think David's probably best to answer the question about whether a peace deal is possible. For me, looking at asset prices, I don't see any way out, because I don't see a situation where the sanctions end. Even if Russia stopped its offensive, I don't see how the West would suddenly become friends with Putin again and say, now you can just export your products however you want. So for me, looking at asset prices, this goes on until Putin goes away. And I don't see that happening anytime soon, but I'm not the expert here. So for me, it's not solvable. There will be no end. We need to find an alternative to Russian energy, because the sanctions won't go away. I don't see why they would go away, even if the war ended.
Thank you, Dan. I think we discussed that point in South Africa, whether Putin was going to go away, and David's answer was no. And have you changed your mind, or do you have more information?
No, I think probably I have the same answer that I had in South Africa, which is that the war will end when Putin wants it to end, or when people inside his country force him to end it, and I don't think the latter is going to happen. So it's really up to Putin. But what I do think is that at some point, if the war keeps going well for Ukraine, and if the Western countries that are supporting Ukraine keep giving them weapons, and heavier weapons, and better weapons, and new weapons that they need, and there's fidelity to sanctions, that at some point Putin will look around and say, you know, I've substantially depleted my armaments. I've lost a lot of soldiers, and I am now vulnerable because of this, degradation of my military. I'm vulnerable to, potentially upheaval in Chechnya, upheaval in the territories in Georgia that I control, and that's when I think he backs off. But when he backs off, he's not going to say I lost, right? It's going to be, this was a special operation, as I told you. We achieved the objectives of the special operation, and we declare success. And then he's not going to just pull out completely out of Ukraine. I think he will kind of freeze the borders as they are, keep troops in the areas that he controls, and there will be some sort of kind of frozen border for a while. I don't think, there could be a ceasefire. There could be an agreement on a ceasefire with the agreement that they would decide later what the borders are, because I don't think President Zelensky can agree to a ceasefire where he cedes territory to Putin. But that's kind of how I see this going. At a certain point, if things keep going on trending the way they are, Putin becomes worried that he's vulnerable, and then he declares victory and stops attacking new areas, and there's a ceasefire.
Thank you, David. I think it's a good time to speak about China, because sometimes we are too focused on Ukraine, Russia, not here, the media, and of course the human suffering is tremendous, but going back more to geopolitics and economy, maybe there's a bigger impact on the rest of the world on the tensions between China and US. And on that, there was a recent and sorry, I'm going to put you on spot because I'm going to ask you a question. I don't know if you know the answer. We should have discussed that. There was a recent regulation from Biden forbidding semiconductors. I really don't understand if it is the use of intellectual property on semiconductors coming from US in China. And then I also read that US companies producing semiconductors in China, they had to close, basically. Or if you were a CEO, an American CEO in a Chinese company producing semiconductors, basically you had to choose to become Chinese and resigning your US passport, or resigning in that company, going back to US. I don't know if you have clarity on that, and what's behind that decision that it seems brutal.
Sure. What the U.S. did, which many people were surprised that Biden took this action, because there were criticisms of Biden as being too soft on China, is he used the Commerce Department's regulations, which the Commerce Department can declare certain goods and certain technology as not being legal to export. And they put in place export controls on semiconductors for China. And what they essentially did by doing this is froze the technology that China has now on semiconductors where it is when the regulation went in place, so that no US company can manufacture semiconductors in China, and they can't provide materials and provide information about how to manufacture semiconductors. And as you mentioned also, no US citizen or green card holder can be involved in the semiconductor business in China. There were a couple objectives that Biden apparently was pursuing here. One was to make it more, recognizing the importance of semiconductors in military technology and surveillance technology and security technology. Biden and the US no longer wanted to allow China to continue to develop that. And we want to make sure that the US and our allies have a leg up on China in development of security, surveillance, and weapons systems. And they likely will work. I mean, if China, unless China can, somehow figure out how to get to the top of the heap in terms of, developing semiconductors, which they aren't there, they're not going to be able to compete. and it's going to, they'll still be able to, develop the semiconductors that they do now and put them in all sorts of electronics products that they sell around the world, but they're not going to have the cutting-edge electronics products. That's one thing they did. The other thing the U.S. did, which I kind of see as a companion, is the U.S. Congress in July passed the CHIPS Act, which provided money incentives for U.S. companies to build semiconductors. Again, that's the U.S.'s effort to bring semiconductor business back to the U.S. because of its importance in weapons and surveillance and other security technology, and make sure that the U.S. and our allies control that better versus China.
Well, I understand the point that the United States might not want Chinese satellites or Chinese high technology chips and semiconductors to be used in Chinese military equipment, but and maybe, I don't know if Dan can help on the impact on the economy, but it also seems that China, that exports so many, I wouldn't say low quality, but less developed equipment like calculators, fridge, like all the, I mean, every piece of equipment today uses chips and semiconductors. So I don't know, again, I don't know if you know about that, Dan, but what's the impact of this apparent tension in the market of semiconductors for the economy?
So again, this is one more area where as investors we see a creation of the West and the rest, because very clearly China won't just sit back and accept this defeat. They're going to invest large amounts of capital. And I don't understand why they wouldn't be able to catch up. So I think that it's really just a delaying tactic for technological leadership, and in just one very specific case where we're talking about advanced chips, fast processing capabilities. Yesterday Biden was at this ceremonial opening of the TSMC factory, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing plant in Phoenix, because TSMC has decided to invest $40 billion into the US manufacturing plant so they can produce chips there. Now, for someone who used to be an equity analyst, 10 years ago, if you had talked to TSMC and asked them if they had any intention to produce outside of Taiwan, they would have said no. Taiwan is where we have all of our capability, we're committed to Taiwan, we're not going to start manufacturing outside Taiwan. I think now even Taiwan has understood that they're going to need to play the West and the rest game, and they're going to need to produce in the US. From a European perspective, it's very worrying because we have also chip manufacturing, design, fab, like ASML, who all of a sudden are being told by the US that they can't work with China anymore, which is one of their main clients. At the same time, the incentives that come from the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, also incentivize, for example, cars that use semiconductor technology that is US based. So German car companies all of a sudden are thinking they better manufacture more in the US rather than in Germany because otherwise they won't benefit from the incentive structures. So as an asset allocator, it's important, an investor, it's important for us to recognize we keep drifting, away from what we had before, which was really global free trade, and we increasingly have barriers. And what it means day to day for a company, I can tell you, I just recently visited one in Switzerland. The great thing about Switzerland is you can go to any tiny village, anywhere in the country, and you will find a global leader in some widget you had no idea anyone needed for some industrial process that you didn't know existed. But we have these companies everywhere. And one that I found was a company that makes pipettes. If you get a test in a lab, it's a med tech company. If you get a test in a lab, that little vial where the fluid is collected, that's called a pipette. And it's a lot more high tech than you think because you need to collect pipettes and you need to manage them, sometimes 100 at a time. And they're specialized in this. Now this was 3 years ago, this visit. So before all of the recent events we're talking about. They were explaining to me that business, because COVID is going crazy, is wonderful, they're clients of mine now, so I'm also really happy because I get to manage their pension funds, and they're making lots of money. And so, you know, at one point I said, yeah, but, you know, there must be something, you know, any challenges, hard to find workforce in the area maybe. And they said, no, the biggest challenge they have is that the US clients, these are US hospitals that are purchasing, are self-regulating already because they're worried about, you know, potential new regulation. They want all the pipettes and all the medtech equipment that they produce to be zero China component. Okay, so no problem, because we're Swiss, we do business with whoever. And so we'll make it, no China components, that's great. And then it turned out that the Chinese clients wanted the same, no US components. So all of a sudden, they have 2 production lines. That's inflationary. Once again, I'm back to my inflation topic. This pendulum swinging away from globalization is a structural driver of inflation long term. And I'm not one of these people who's concerned about inflation in the US staying at 9%. Definitely not. I think it's going to come crashing down back to 3–4% early next year. But I think it's going to be higher than it was in the 10 years before COVID, because we have things like this that just bring inflation into the system. We become less efficient as the world also remilitarizes, right? I mean, one of the side effects is that NATO has won a bunch of new clients to sell guns to. I'm not taking sides here, it's just a fact, it's just the way it is, right? We have Finland now as a NATO member. We all of a sudden have AUKUS, which popped up out of nowhere, and not much to Macron's liking. And we have a understanding among many democracies like Germany that no, you can't just outsource your security, and you can't outsource your energy to Russia, and outsource your growth to China, and then all of a sudden you're kind of in a sticky situation because you don't control anything anymore. So this topic about nearshoring, onshoring, reshoring, that's going to be inflationary. For me though, you know, I need to make money, so I'm looking for the good opportunities. And where do you want to be invested? Who benefits from this? Indonesia. You know, Indonesia has great demographics, raising population. If I want to get my manufacturing out of China but keep it close to Southeast Asia, I'm going to be investing in Indonesia. I'm an American manufacturer, let's say I'm Apple, and I don't like what's going on at Foxconn in China because of the lockdowns, and I'm also concerned about parts and what's going to happen from a regulatory perspective. What do? I mean, I can bring it to the US or maybe Mexico. What's the one of the best performing currencies this year is the Mexican peso. It's because of nearshoring, it's because of onshoring. They're a big beneficiary of this trend, and also some commodity exports. But for sure, this is the way that we need to position. And it also means that maybe I need to reevaluate my investment in China, because as a global allocator, you know, I might end up having to deal with some US sanction that tells me I'm not allowed to invest in China. Everything becomes more complicated, everything becomes something that we need to review. Yeah, but that's where we stand.
Yeah,
insecurity.
In terms of big winners and big losers of all these tensions, to which countries? Well, you just mentioned Mexico. I don't know, and Indonesia. Any other winners? Well, and who would be the big losers?
I'm a big fan of the emerging markets because if I look at EM debt in particular, I get phenomenal yields, and especially if I'm an active EM debt investor and I can choose where I'm investing, I think that it's a great opportunity. And the market sell-off in fixed income, by the way, that we saw last year was, I mean, it's just ridiculous. It's something that we haven't seen since the 1930s, and we don't have the same structural issues as the 1930s. The reason for the sell-off was rates volatility. Again, if I don't know what's happening with rates, I don't know what my investment is worth, and I just sell. But that's ridiculous because, you know, I don't think Germany's going bankrupt. I don't think the US is going to go bankrupt anytime soon. So I think right now we have a once-in-a-decade opportunity to pick up treasuries with a 4% yield. Do it. It's amazing, you know, 4% yield on that's not going to stay. They're going to come back down. Dollar's going to weaken. Rates are going to come lower. Remember, we spent, ever since the financial crisis, we've been desperately trying to create inflation in the West. And it hasn't worked. We desperately wanted inflation, and it just it didn't work. And then all of a sudden, because of COVID and super loose monetary policy, we had the big bang, and it all came at one time. And then we freaked out, and now we've been hiking rates like crazy. So I think you're going to see them come back down just as fast as the economy shrinks next year, and it will. You already see economic momentum contracting. And so fixed income for me is the opportunity, especially in emerging markets. I think it's too early on high yield or investment grade credit because the spreads aren't supportive enough. But emerging market debt, I think, is where you want to be. And by the way, in emerging markets, it's a new paradigm also. You know, for the 10 years before COVID, everyone wanted China and Southeast Asia. Now, again, what do you want? You want Brazil, you want Mexico, you want commodity exporters because they essentially print dollars. And so they won't have an issue with higher rates because they can service it. Countries that are commodity importers like China might have a hard time servicing debt, more so than they don't have a debt problem. But other commodity importers would have a bigger problem because they can't print hard currency.
If you were so interested in raising the inflation rates in the West, you should have come to Argentina to do a master's.
I've been learning about all the different I've only been in Argentina a few days now, but I've been learning about all the different types of dollar you have. It's so interesting. So I had no idea. Blue, yellow.
Blue is the best. On that note, on Argentina and Latin America, what can you tell us about, let's say, the next 5 years? Let's escape a little bit from what's happening now. In the next 5 years, in connection with all these changes of players or refocusing more in the United States than Asia.
Yeah, I'll share one or two thoughts, but I'd actually even have a question to David on this one, because a lot depends on U.S.'s foreign policy. But I would say that, again, back to the fear and insecurity part, a lot of the repricing of Latam assets has been based on elections, whether they're in Colombia or whether they're in Brazil. You know, people have just been made insecure, or these international investors have been made insecure because they're not sure what direction we're going politically in Latam, and whether that is good or bad for asset prices. And as soon as you add that insecurity into the mix, your country risk goes up in the valuation of the asset, and people look for other assets. So that's what I would say is the short-term negative. Let's maybe give the new governments a chance to show themselves, prove themselves, and see how things develop. Because I think the underlying macro isn't that bad. Again, especially around commodities. You know, La Nina has been bad for Argentina, but it's been good for Brazil. It's been good for Australia. It kind of depends where. I'm not counting Australia to the emerging markets, so the weather patterns have different impacts in different places. But again, back to the Russia-Ukraine, prices for commodities are going to be elevated for some time, not just because Russia-Ukraine, but also very much so. And prices for oil, energy products, are going to be elevated for quite some time. So I think anyone that has the ability to export commodities is structurally in a very good place. What would be good is if those people that export or that print those dollars would repatriate them back into the local economy and invest. That's one point. The other point on rates and inflation, who were the first two countries to start hiking interest rates when we had inflation creeping into the system? Remember, the Fed and the ECB were telling you, no, there's inflation, no, look the other way, it doesn't exist, it's transitory, it doesn't exist. They were in denial. Brazil and Russia were hiking, busily, aggressively hiking, way before Western nations started on the hiking path. So actually the adults in the room in terms of monetary policy are, one, an economy that I can't invest in anymore, and the other one, of course, is your neighbor, is Brazil, where now inflation is starting to come down again because the super high rates have slowed the economy and are going to bring inflation back down again. So that also gives you, that declining rate situation gives you once again an opportunity in fixed income.
Thank you, Dan. I thought you had a question for David? Or?
Yes, exactly. So the part of the puzzle is, you know, geopolitics. The U.S. has always been so focused on East, you know, managing East, and Latam somehow seemingly gets forgotten. But when I look at Venezuela, it's clear that all of a sudden the U.S. has remembered that there's some key players down here, and especially when we have an energy crisis and Chevron finds some opportunities. We now have a situation where in Venezuela we have the Russians, the Chinese, and the Americans all partying together. It seems like it could go very well, and it's a huge opportunity, or maybe there's some fireworks, you know, they're about to.
Yeah, I think the U.S. perspective on Latin America is that we have really good alliances here, and we don't need another place, you know, another trouble spot to worry about, right? So that's, you know, that's kind of how Americans look at it right now. We've got too many problems in too many places around the world, and Venezuela was a high priority, especially under President Trump. You know, supporting regime change, the hope for regime change in Venezuela. That's why the sanctions were so harsh on Venezuela. But that became a political expediency when the #1 priority became supporting Ukraine and putting sanctions on Russia and not destroying the global economy because of it. And so suddenly, you know, President Biden has a whole team at the White House that spends all their time figuring out how to increase oil production. You know, this is an administration that's committed to, you know, reducing carbon emissions, but they're actually also spending time trying to increase oil production. That's why President Biden went to Saudi Arabia, you know, begged Saudi Arabia and OPEC to, you know, increase their production of oil, which they didn't agree to do. And so that's why the U.S. has been softer on Venezuela, is looking for production from even places that are not friends.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Dan. Now it's your turn for any questions from the public. I'm going to hand the microphone. You pass it among yourselves. Please indicate your name and nationality, please. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Omotola Aria. I'm Nigerian and I also live in London, so I'm back and forth. Thank you very much, Dan. My question is primarily to you. Just considering your position as an asset allocator, and I can imagine you already have clients that are already exposed in some way, shape or form to Russian energy. How do you risk manage for those clients, considering, for example, the implications of COVID and central bank rate hiking and the like? So that's more the hedging question. So the risk management question, how do you already risk manage for clients who already have exposure to those assets that are obviously now very troublesome? And then on the speculation side, for clients that do want to be exposed to those kinds of assets and they want to take some risk, a significant risk, how do you structure and how do you price for them to ensure that they do make money, even though it's something that there isn't much appetite for in sort of invest in? How do you ensure that, okay, this is something where clients are going to make money and you structure it properly in a way that's beneficial for them, regardless of the fact that it's probably not something they should be invested in?
So, Omotola, thanks for the question. I'd say that the direct exposure question is very easy because it's sanctioned, so I can't touch it. There's no way I can touch any direct exposure. What happened was there was like a period where, say, you know, Gazprom bonds or Russian railway bonds or Norilsk nickel equity, there was a lot of investment, not a lot, but there was, you know, relative to the benchmark, the same investment in Russia as you can expect for any other emerging market. Those things had to be unwound, and it was very difficult, you know, because there was no pricing, and you know they become sanctioned. So we're not allowed to touch those. Those are frozen. But there still is indirect exposure, like you say, to energy volatility. But like we do in any asset class, is through diversification that we manage to try and hedge that out. I personally, in my discretionary mandates, don't like to use derivatives. I just find that you have the timing element that makes it very difficult to win with a derivative. and it's just always going to cost you money. So I look at other asset classes to provide me some sort of alternative diversification. And so, for example, if I'm looking at greenflation as a topic, this whole energy transition topic, you know, I understand that there are actually some beneficiaries, because you can't build a windmill, you can't build a solar panel without steel, without copper. You know, you need those basic resources, which are the very same resources that many of the primitive ESG investors are excluding from their portfolios because they think they're dirty. And so that's a way to still have exposure to those assets. Yeah, and otherwise, this is probably not the answer you're looking for, but it's why I find currency diversification in portfolios so important, because I'm still structurally bullish long-term the dollar. I just think that we've reached peak dollar short-term, and we're going to probably see a 10% devaluation in dollar, or depreciation in dollar trade-weighted over the next 6 months. So it's important to have a currency diversification, and beyond typical fiat currencies, I find gold very important to have in your portfolios. When I say very important, a balanced mandate with me has about 5% allocation to gold, because it's also a nice geopolitical risk hedge. And in fact, in February of this year, when the invasion happened, that's exactly when it provided me security. It was the only thing that didn't get knocked. Otherwise, the rest of the year it was terrible, because it's, you know, it's inversely correlated to rates. So if rates go up, it comes down, because clearly my opportunity cost is higher. If I can get 4% on a treasury, why do I want to own gold? But given my assumption that rates are coming down, that we're past peak hawkishness and past peak inflation, I think gold is a great thing to own from now to the next 6-12 months.
Anyone wants a mic? Tomás y después Alfredo.
Tommy Allende from Argentina. This is for Dan. What's your view on crypto? An easy question right now.
I think one of my colleagues asked you to ask me. Yeah, so my standard answer is that I'm fascinated with the technology, but I don't understand the coins, because they're not a currency. They're clearly way too volatile to be a currency in my asset allocation matrix. And yes, had I had them in there, you know, my performance would have been much better up until the sell-off. But again, it's that volatility that does me no good. It doesn't have a yield. So from that perspective, I think it's way too early for, say, BlackRock or whoever to be adding it to a typical SAA in a multi-asset class portfolio. However, I think the underlying technology is like the internet. And in 1999, you know, we would have been talking about voice over internet protocol. We would have been talking about all the new cool ways we can use the internet. Nowadays, no one talks about that. It's in every business process, in every company. It's part and parcel. And I think, for example, when I'm in Switzerland paying an arm and a leg for my solicitor, I know I'm talking to a group of lawyers, by the way. Paying an arm and a leg for my solicitor just to, you know, put a stamp on a document and then telling me you need to wait 2 weeks for that stamp, then I think, bring on the blockchain, please. You know, like, for sure, decentralized trust is a great idea, but, you know, let's see how long it takes for it to actually take hold, because, yeah, it's maybe a bit like alchemy. Many people have tried to decentralize trust.
Thank you, Alfredo.
Yeah, maybe can I do two?
It's a different price.
Really quick. So basically one of each.
Sorry, tell name and nationality for the audience.
Alfredo Vargas, I'm from Venezuela. So my first question will be on the same investment side. So what about going allocation to alternatives, specifically venture capital? I did that with crypto and technology. And on the other side, totally different. It's about a little bit of what, I mean, like, we've seen a lot of ways, like the different ways of how the US have managed the relationship with Latin America. So I think that we discussed today the strategic importance as a region on the nearshoring and supply chain for the U.S. Mexico is taking a huge piece of this because of obvious reasons, but we've seen also the consequences of maybe the U.S. dealing with more foreign countries with plenty of complications. We saw it like in the Middle East, we see what's going on with China, with Russia and Ukraine. So, do you think it's maybe I don't know if it's an expectation, but how can the U.S. change a little bit and have more coherent policy between, I don't know, each side of the parties, right? Because, for example, in Venezuela, Trump had a very kind of different approach of what Biden is taking. But I think at the end of the day, those swings, really at the end of the day, they hurt the underlying people around the region, no? So, a little bit on that, maybe.
Look, if I lived here in Latin America and I was looking at U.S. policy, I would be like, it doesn't really make sense because it keeps changing. And you know, there are big ideological differences between Democrats and Republicans. One thing that isn't talked about a lot, but the Biden administration, and not necessarily the president as much as some people in the White House and the State Department, they're really, really committed to human rights. There were big battles inside the State Department over human rights. This was part of the problem with Saudi Arabia. It's why Saudi Arabia wouldn't help us when we needed them to increase oil production, because the team in the State Department that was responsible for human rights had been so hard on Saudi Arabia, wouldn't give visits, and so when it came time for the U.S. to need something from Saudi Arabia said no. And I think that applies a little bit to Latin America. You know, this administration is, you know, very critical of countries that have human rights problems. You know, which can be confusing because, you know, we have our own human rights problems and our own problems with elections inside the U.S. You know, there's a concern here about the changes in governments in some countries, Bolivia, Peru, you know, Guatemala, other countries, and following the model of Venezuela, there's a deep desire not to let that happen. You know, support for democracy is one of the most important things that particularly this administration talks about. And then there's the biggest focus, you know, in our hemisphere is also on the Northern Triangle countries, unfortunately, because that's where the biggest problems are, in Honduras and El Salvador, or at least from a U.S. perspective. The biggest problems are in Honduras and El Salvador and Guatemala, because we have so many immigrants coming into the U.S. illegally from those three countries, and they're basically economic migrants, economic refugees who are departing because of lack of jobs, bad economies, and crime. And there's and we can't even help them. Those are small countries with great resources and with great people, with great work ethic, and we haven't even been able to solve that problem. So I think there's that whole issue that takes up a lot of the time of those people in the White House administration who work on Latin America policy. And so that's why I said earlier, I just think there's this view like we just don't need any more problems right here in our backyard. Let's just kind of support democracy, support human rights, hope things work out. And maybe the policy doesn't really make sense because it changes from administration to administration. But until there's a crisis like Venezuela, we don't really do much.
And the question on venture capital, I guess, is more a question private or liquids. But yeah, as part of, so in my alternative, I only do liquids. But obviously, I have clients and I advise clients, and every ultra high or high has an allocation to private markets. I would just say that the valuations right now, because there's been so much flow into private markets, needs a reset before I venture into, excuse the pun, that type of an investment. I wouldn't give up my liquidity premium right now because it's it's the natural course. It will take longer for the valuations to reset. But otherwise, in the liquid alternatives markets, yeah, I mean, they're more appealing. We know we're going into a recession. Technically, we're probably already in one. So growth is going to be low, which means that your equity return from global equities is going to be mid-single digits. No great, party there. And then you're going to have, whatever you can get out of bond markets. And so all of a sudden alternatives with lower, volatility and drawdown become quite appealing. So if you can find yourself things like, good long-short strategies or, merge arb or whatever other alternative. In my portfolios, we're allocated to insurance-linked securities, cat bonds, as a way to try and get non-correlated return. So yeah, bullish on alternatives, but not private markets.
Thank you.
Hi, Yasmin Kupal. I'm from Venezuela, live in the US. I actually also had 2 questions. I'll start with David. When I think about Putin, I think of him akin to Assad in Syria, Maduro in Venezuela, just someone who's just not going to give up easily, and when cornered might actually do dangerous things. What do you think the risk of nuclear escalation is?
I think my analysis of Putin is that he is completely self-interested. Everything he does is out of self-interest. He attacked Ukraine because he saw some sort of threat to having a successful democracy on the border of Russia, and that threat was not a threat to Russian people, it was a threat to him and to his ability to be president until 2034. He amended the Constitution so he could be president until 2034. So using nuclear weapons could really threaten his own self-interest, because I think he understands that once he did that, NATO likely would engage directly against Russia, and then he would really have a hard time staying in power. So I think he likes to use the threat of nuclear weapons. That's very effective for him. It gives him a lot of leverage, but he's a bit of a Roger Dodger. He's very, very clever. He kind of gets around, direct confrontation with him, and he doesn't want a confrontation that could ultimately take him out of power, and I think that's likely what would happen if he used nuclear weapons. I think he realizes that. So I think it's low, but it's not non-existent.
Thank you. And then, Dan, a question for you. You've been talking a lot about inflation, asset allocation, and it feels like the source of inflation in the US is very different than the one in Europe. Europe driven so much by commodities. The labor market in the US still seems, frankly, really resilient. And so when you think about that, and in light of concerns of the market speculating as to whether the Fed has peaked or not, and based on markets today, it feels like the market thinks that the Fed is going to stop pretty soon, but we'll have to wait and see where the data is. Why not just, given the uncertainty, across regions and across products, why not just park your money in cash and wait for more certainty?
So if you're worried about inflation, is the best way to lose your money is to park it in cash? Because then you're guaranteed to lose your money, maybe just at a lower rate. So if you're worried that inflation stays at 8%, you're basically losing 8% a year. It's not appealing.
Right, but you said inflation's coming down.
Yes, so on my assumption, so you're saying on my assumption it might be a good idea to allocate to cash rather than, oh, I understand now, sorry, okay, sorry, you're smarter than me. It takes me a while. We have to, yeah. Yeah, maybe, but again, I think if the risk-free asset, the only free lunch in town for the first time in 20, 30 years is giving me 4%, then I prefer to park it in government bonds rather than in cash. And also, I manage money for global investors, so the allocation looks a little bit different if you're a dollar or a Swiss franc or a peso investor. The diversification is important. cash isn't necessarily always, it's clearly, there's no liquidity alternative to cash, but even very, short maturity debt can be a nice way to get a little bit of a pickup and augment your returns, because again, we expect slowbalization would be another one of these trendy words right now. So it's a slowing of globalization and a slow, macroeconomic growth. That means that your asset class returns are going to be pretty moderated for the foreseeable future. So everywhere where we can try and extract a little bit more is what we're trying to do.
Thank you, Dan.
You, Dan, I don't know if there are any more questions. So thank you very much. I would like to ask for the people in the fire to put full steam on that fire and get the asado ready. If you have any other questions, let's do it over some Malbec and asado, and you can continue speaking with David and Dan. Thank you very much. That was extremely interesting. Thank you, Alejandro Moy. Where is Alejandro? Thank you for decorating all our events with your beautiful paintings, like you did in Teatro Colón. And finally, thank you to Bodegas del Fin del Mundo, because the Malbec we are going to enjoy, and the espumante we are going to enjoy. Sorry, it's from Bodegas del Fin del Mundo, Argentinian. So thank you. Let's enjoy the rest of the night.